One, two, three, four.
Hello, you're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But SKYLIT is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep SKYLIT alive, please visit our website at skylitbooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast series, and I'm your host, Maddie Gobbo. You may notice my voice is a little bit muffled today. I'm working in the store and conducting this interview from our upstairs back room in the Arts Annex, which is a bit chaotic, but I'm very excited to be hosting these two great authors, Brian Evenson and David Leo Rice. They're going to be talking about David's new book, A Room in Dodge City, Volume 2. Welcome to the podcast, you guys. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I took you by surprise there.
We didn't know we were here.
I know. Where is here, though? You know, we're in some kind of ether.
Everything is all here now. Yeah.
It's somewhere.
All right. So I want to go ahead and give you guys your formal introduction. And then, David, you're going to read a bit from the book, and then the two of you will launch into a fascinating conversation. All right. So a bit about the book. A Room in Dodge City, Volume 2. So this is the second book in the Room in Dodge City trilogy. It is a Bildungsroman couched in a tale of folk horror and cosmic paranoia. It's also an elegy for the declining art of cinema. Set in a bizarre Western town, this book follows a nameless drifter who considers what happens when drifting on is no longer an option. Focusing on the mysterious workings of the Dodge City film industry and the personality cult surrounding Blut Branson, its most legendary director, Volume 2 asks hard questions about the nature of art, fame, competition, and ultimately the ongoing struggle to be born. A mystical inquiry into the sacred and the profane, it expands the universe of the first volume while exploring yet stranger territory and laying the foundation for the trilogy's apocalyptic finale. All right, so David Leo Rice, the author of this trilogy, is an author and animator based in New York City. His books include Angel House, A Room in Dodge City, and A Room in Dodge City Volume 2, the middle installment in a trilogy. His short story collection, Drifter, is forthcoming in June. And in conversation with David today is Brian Evenson. Brian Evenson is the recipient of 3 O. Henry Prizes and has been a finalist for the Edgar Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the World Fantasy Award. He actually just won the Shirley Jackson Award and the World Fantasy Award for his new collection, Song for the Unraveling of the World. He is also the winner of the International Horror Guild Award and the American Library Association's Award for Best Horror Novel, and his work has been named in Time Out New York's top books. He happens to be one of my favorite short story writers of all time. I hope you guys check him out. All right, so Brian and David, welcome. Glad you're here. David, you want to kick us off with a little selection from the book?
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you for having us, and thanks to Brian for being here. And yeah, he's one of my favorite short story writers as well. So we have that in common. Cool. Okay, so I'll just read. You set it up beautifully, so there's not too much to summarize. I thought I would just read a section from almost the exact center of the book, in which this drifter character has signed up to be a location scout for Blut Branson, who's this kind of legendary, almost overarching filmmaker presence in Dodge City, who some believe actually created Dodge City as a set for one of his films. So he's almost a sort of god figure, creator figure, but there's something very devilish about him as well. So the drifter has signed up to be a location scout, and he's been sent to what he believes is Kazakhstan although in Dodge City, most places end up turning out to still be within Dodge City, but what he calls Kazakhstan. And he's discovered this tower that will end up being very significant to this book, and actually the third book as well. You know, the tower is a kind of central image of the trilogy. And being in the exact center of the second book, it sort of appears in the center of the trilogy. Okay. And it's called the M Tower. Inside the M Tower, I take my first gulp from the faucet and think, I'll spend the night alone in here on the very top floor, surveying the landscape. If, in the morning, I still can't bear the thought of surrendering it to Branson, I'll prepare to take my last stand then. When I've exhausted myself pacing the upper levels in contemplation, I either fall asleep and begin to dream, or fall into a waking trance in which my subconscious takes over all bodily and psychic function. Either way, I feel as though I'm finally seeing the M Tower for what it is. A shadow of its past or future self, I think, just like me. The synthesis rings true. One way or another, for better or worse, the M Tower and I are inseparable. One expresses through architecture what the other expresses through biology and, maybe, a soul. My perspective zooms out until I can see us both, one inside the other, a homunculus in a shell that in turn houses its own homunculus that in turn... There's something, though, that we can't see, neither the man in the tower nor the tower in the man. Some grander unity vanishes from sight as the sun goes down over the Kazakh steppe and the chirping of crickets and the dusty winging of bats fills the air. If only, I think, the sun would rise in the morning over a slightly different world, or if a slightly different sun would rise, some fruition would surely be possible, some means of seeing far enough inside myself or all the way beyond myself, such that I would no longer waste my days and years in the half-hearted attempt to work for someone else, but would rather come at last fully into my own, and the embryos that have incubated for so long inside me would hatch, and the whole world would know what they are. If only I could find the right window, I go on thinking, to gaze out from the M Tower onto the astral landscape beyond, or else perhaps a hidden staircase within, a staircase that leads all the way down, to the vault or the altar or the catacombs, whatever it may be, to the foundation itself. Then there, hidden, would be what I'm lacking. The knowledge, the insight, the stamina to force into reality, to hammer into the world. That which has lain latent and rotting for far too long in my gut, rendering me fit only to grovel at Branson's feet. I'm pacing the tower maniacally now, up and down its cold stone stairs like some undead caretaker, skidding in the dust and catching myself just before falling out the wide open windows, the night deep and thick as I chase the deliverance that I feel certain is at hand, closer than it's ever been and closer than it will ever be again. I decide that it's either a glimpse of my past, an answer finally to the question of where I came from, or else of my future, a long delayed clue as to where, after all this circular travel, I'm going or ought to go. I'd kill for either one, I think, for any certainty at all, any clue even, any means out from under the shadow of Luke Branson and into my own skin, the shadow of a grown man, a real director, someone capable of... I collapse on one of the stone staircases and wake up if I'd been sleeping, or fall asleep if I'd been awake. Either way, the feed is cut, the scene is over. My last, awful thought just before total darkness envelops me. Might it be possible that all of this, every thought I've just had, is nothing but a canned version of yet another Luke Branson origin story? One more among so many thousands of how the great man came to be and why his greatness, as if I didn't know already, so infinitely outstrips my own. And we can leave our poor drifter there for the moment.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Good to see you.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure to see you too. I can see you. The audience isn't going to be able to see you, obviously.
Yeah. Good thing we're nowhere.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I'm kind of in your room with you.
That's right.
Which is one of the really strange things about just this period of time, is the way in which these kind of private spaces are always adjacent to your own private space. And that, I think, just that's one way to think about this book, is just the one very strange thing about it is the way that everything seems just one step or two steps away from Dodge City. Mm-hmm. That there is like the whole notion of boundaries and the length and distance have really collapsed in this book, so that everything is kind of just right there.
For sure, yeah, and I think there's an ambivalence about if that's good or bad. That on the one hand, the
right.
town is proud to have cannibalized the world and to be an autonomous world. On the other hand,
right.
there's a sort of mounting horror that not only could you never escape, but you almost couldn't even conceive of what it would mean to escape. Like even the idea of a place outside of it is inside of it.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, that seems to tie to just the way in which culture works now for us. The fact that everybody's watching the same TV shows, this whole thing of the way in which we're kind of interacting with the world is mediated very similarly, whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast or elsewhere.
100%, and that we're mediating it by being in it. You see so much of the news is like people live streaming themselves being in places and also watching themselves doing it and watching themselves commenting on doing it. And the idea that there's any distinction between what we would normally think of as three levels of like actor, director, and audience.
Mm-hmm.
Those things are now, it's the three collapsing into one. Right?
The actor is also the director, and is the
audience. Yeah,
right, exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of a maddening state.
And it's strange because that's on one hand it's so kind of insular because now you only need one person to do everything, and on the other hand it's like it's so expansive because if you do get the likes and the hits, then suddenly you're being watched by all sorts of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Who are both there and not there, who are there with you in whatever moment you're broadcasting to them and who are dispersed through this very numinous and kind of haunted network.
Yeah. Well, so the book is called A Room in Dodge City, Volume 2, the Blue Branson Era.
Yeah.
I don't think you really need to read the first one first, is my sense of it. That you can start with Volume 2. It's a question of which facet of the world you want to enter into first.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think of the first one as being, arrival, right? This drifter shows up in Dodge City, although it quickly becomes questionable whether there was anywhere before it, but he shows up with at least the narrative of being a drifter. Right. And it's, and I think it's really about outsiderness, sort of how in Volume 1, like how is this narrator in this place that has these rituals and these various kind of sacred histories and heresies and, different authority figures and different cults and different things that have been suppressed or that have been, that are apocryphal. And then Volume 2 really is about how do you integrate yourself once you've decided that you're not going to leave, perhaps for the reason we were saying before, that you realize you can't leave because there is no there in the sense of being able to go someplace else. Yeah.
Well, and the drifter, I mean, he ends up being a kind of proxy for the audience because he knows very little, just as we do. And it's one way, I think, of both having what I would call the intense weirdness of this book, which is one thing I admire about it, and of the first book as well. But then also being able to navigate it, have someone who is maybe a little bit confused and is taking it in the same way you are.
Yeah. And that he's, I mean, and obviously myself as the author, as well as the reader, is like you're stuck in his head. So it's possible that from the perspective of another character, he isn't in good faith. But I think as the reader, we assume that he is, and the way that he's perceiving things is pretty much not only the way we should, but almost the only way we could, that you couldn't exactly write these stories from another character's point of view.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And so, of course, I mean, we've already kind of mentioned this, but Dodge City is strange, surreal, even more surreal than the real Dodge City. It's not, I mean, what is its relationship to actual Dodge City?
It's a good question. And I should say I'm in Kansas right now. I'm sort of working on number 3 from this little house in the center of Kansas. So I feel closer to the spirit of Dodge City than I usually do. I think it has to do with cinema and recreation, and the idea that the actual Dodge City in Kansas is at once a real place. I mean, it is an actual, site of sort of Western lore and, legends were made there and all these iconic events occurred there, but then has also been mythologized to the point where if you go to the place on the map today called Dodge City, it really is like a theme park, but it's a theme park of itself.
Right. Similar to like Salem in Massachusetts. With
100%.
Yeah.
And it relates to cinema in that regard, that it's like the reason, it's this kind of echo chamber between, you could say, Dodge City and Hollywood, in the sense that the legend of Dodge City may have occurred there, but then it was reified and turned into a legend in Hollywood, which then bounced back to Dodge City. And it's this kind of feedback loop that the whole Western's relation to the West Coast is that feedback loop.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to me the way, as someone who grew up in the West, just the way that those kinds of myths of the West that you got in books and films really came to kind of inform people's ways of thinking about themselves.
Mhm.
So it ends up being both something that's depicting something that may be there, but it's also generative. It ends up kind of creating the reality.
Exactly, while claiming to depict the history.
Right, right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's almost like, it's true. I mean, in your work and mine, I think we're both interested in, how is violence depicted, and sort of
Mhm.
what are the ways in which it's, what layers does it go through to be turned into something that has a significance that the actual event probably can't really have, and like
Yeah,
where in our psychology is that, and how
yeah,
does
yeah.
literature relate to that? And certainly Westerns are,
Yeah,
this,
no,
this sort of
Westerns are,
purification by violence, basically.
yeah, they're a huge part of that, I think, in terms of just the
Yeah,
way in which we think about violence as a, redemptive or not, or whatever. Yeah.
exactly.
So it is this kind of thing where Dodge City is, seems like almost a pseudo LA, or like it's maybe, I don't know, Simi Valley next to LA or something.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and so in a way, I mean, one thing that's interesting to me, and one reason it's exciting for me to do this talk at SKYLIT, is that it is almost like this book is sending the myth of LA back to itself.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I was interested in that. We were talking before about, Zoom, or the way we're speaking, being this sort of collage of
Yeah.
juxtaposing things that are distant,
Hmm.
but then, putting them right next to each other, the way like a surrealist collage might do. And Dodge City functions in that same way, that in volume 2, he discovers that the Hollywood Hills literally ring Dodge City,
Right. Right.
and that this sort of world of, Blut Branson, and this kind of power structure of the Dodge City film industry is like looming down on the town from something that's geographically right outside of it.
Right.
But it's a kind of numinous border. Like he only ever crosses it in this sort of dark limo. And it's like
Yeah.
someplace you couldn't get on foot. I don't think, like, it doesn't quite exist, but
Right.
but
Yeah.
it does.
Well, and I think one of the things I like about this book too is it is, when I think about psychogeography,
Mhm.
this seems to me like psychogeography on steroids.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something, yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
And that's something that I love, the idea of psychogeography as, the points at which it becomes indistinguishable, whether you're in your mind or in your body, whether you're
Yeah.
in a space or whether the space is in you.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it's like the objective experience has become so processed through the subjective, that it's actually changed what's physically there, it seems to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but of
Yeah.
course, I mean, as you said at the beginning, since we're seeing this all through the perspective of the drifter, that may not be what's actually happening, but we don't have anywhere else to stand, really.
Yeah. And neither does he, because I think, insofar as it's a Künstlerroman, or, about his attempt to cease being a drifter and become a director, and maybe literally become Blut Branson. There's an ambiguity, because on the one hand, he has this fantasy that if he could go up a level and cease to be, subject to all these things happening and become the director,
Hmm.
that then it would give clarity, or
Right.
then he would reach the real. He would like get out of the clouds, literally, and be able to look down from the hills.
Right. Right.
But I think the opposite possibility is probably more
Right.
likely, that he's going to get deeper in, because he's entering the very myth factory that's creating these myths in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's that myth that a lot of artists have, that I can arrive somewhere as soon as I've done this. I will have arrived, and I'll be happy, or whatever.
Yeah, I will have made it, in a literal sense of like being rescued from a shipwreck or something.
Right, right, exactly. So you have a brother, Rob, who I know, who is a
Yep.
filmmaker, very good filmmaker, I actually think.
Very cool. Me too.
Should we see Rob as connected to Blut Branson in any way?
He is connected to Dodge City, and that we've worked on some film projects related to the books.
Interesting.
Yeah, and certainly my knowledge of LA has grown since he's been there.
Mm-hmm.
So I've spent more time there, and seeing you there. So he is. I can almost imagine my consciousness living in LA through his consciousness there, and going through this.
Okay, interesting.
This Bildungsprocess of becoming a filmmaker in that environment.
Well, and it's interesting too. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't
for
want to talk too much about your brother, because this is about you, but
that's fine.
because some of his work involves kind of very deliberately leaving LA and going to the outskirts and filming kind of forgotten places or forgotten pockets. So in some ways, it's like an inversion in some ways of what you're playing with.
Yeah, and maybe that, I think that's something that is certainly in the Dodge City books and it's in Angel House, the sense of, like a nesting doll structure of towns containing cities.
Right.
So from his point of view, he could live in LA, but it's like his mind and his effort is focused towards this little town, right outside, but also way outside the city.
Right.
And it's really fascinating to me that, because we both, being brothers, grew up in the same town in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And I think we both had the sense that, there was something urban about it. There were a lot of New Yorkers and people from Boston there, but that also, it really was out in the country. It was the small town that had this dream of itself, or this vision of itself, near the city, but being the city. And so that idea is just interesting.
Yeah, Angel House, your earlier book, is very much about this, I think. And about Northampton, and it's about film or videos anyway as well. Yeah.
And the sense that your dream of being like an urban artist, of sort of making it in the world, is itself a small town dream because it's formed from being in the small town. In a way that people who grow up in cities maybe don't have that, they still have ambition, but the way they think about going to the city to make it is very different.
Well, it's not a question of leaving and arriving someplace in the same way.
Absolutely.
Well, so I was teasing a little about Rob, but it's also, Blue Branson is this kind of like, he's a director, but he also seems almost like an author position. He's like this place that can be occupied potentially by other people. As the book goes on, you get a sense that it's not completely clear that there's one Blue Branson, or even that there is a Blue Branson, or at the same time, there's this huge body of work that's all kind of associated with that.
And it, I'm interested in the idea of, this sort of elegy for, like we said before, of like the decline of cinema as this sacred art form, which is now totally exacerbated by theaters being closed. But also this sense that a partly naive dream on my own part and on the part of the townspeople is that there could be like a singular figure who produces singular work.
Right.
It's like, this is, Fellini who made these films, or whatever great figure you look or something. Whereas now I think, like we were saying earlier on, there's this much deeper sense that we're in an extremely diffuse and shapeless media environment.
Which I would say is true of not just film, but literature as well. It's like I think it used to be, or at least we had the impression that a lot of the work that was important was being published on, only a couple of big presses. And now it's really just kind of spread out. It's like I find myself reading stuff from presses all over the country, big and small, and just, trying to make my way through it in some ways. Yeah, right.
Which I think there are really beautiful aspects to it. There's a kind of fear of the loss of the canonical, or, the great, like in Dodge City, they go to the temple, which only shows Branson films, and they only show it there. And there's a ritual aspect to it that on the one hand, they mourn when that becomes decentralized, or like you were saying, when the fear arises that Branson isn't singular and maybe doesn't exist. But on the other hand, there's something really optimistic about it, of just a much greater plurality of ideas and of people and of presses and of locations. And I think that's to be encouraged at this point.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, I feel like in that sense, the book is a kind of response to just the kind of cultural milieu or cultural myths that we grew up in. This idea that you can have the great director, and we still have that idea to some degree, but I don't think not as vehemently as we used to. Or the idea, there's 5 major French philosophers that are important figures, and and now it seems to have dispersed. We're just looking for the next king of philosophy. I think that's one thing that's quite interesting about the book, just the way in which it both acknowledges the way in which those myths are functioning and still functioning, but also is intent on compromising them and exploding.
And seeing how they're almost self-contradictory, right? Because if you think of those 80s French philosophers, on the one hand, a lot of what they were saying is that things are diffuse and decentralized, but they themselves were the center of that.
Right.
Which is kind of an interesting trick to pull out. And that's something that, I try to, I think both of our work has a lot of darkness, but also a lot of humor, and I try to have a kind of optimism that I think my characters are always looking for the real, and they're
Right.
pretty sure that it's been deconsecrated from any place where they would think to look for it,
Yeah.
whether it's the video store or the,
Right.
the Oracle or any of these, the great director, like those things have kind of fallen. But there's something tenacious about the real, that it often does crop up in unexpected places.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
unpredictably. It's not like you can know where to look for it, but it's like certain moments there is a breakthrough of something that does still seem true.
Yeah. And I hadn't thought about it that way, but I do think that it's true with your work that it's not pessimistic. It's not exactly optimistic either, but tenacious is a good word for it. I mean, it's kind of, there's a kind of doggedness in terms of keeping on going or being willing to not to give up. And there is kind of this notion that, there's still some potential there. The obsession that they have with the mountains surrounding Dodge City, for instance, or, the idea that you can arrive kind of and be sort of a Blue Branson-esque figure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All those things are, and that's, I think that's a lot about the way in which, we live in this very strange, fractured collection of myths.
Mm-hmm.
And we both acknowledge their weaknesses and still have a hard time not living by them.
Yeah, because maybe it's that they're weak, or they've become weak over time in the forms that they're in, but they still contain some energy, so that when they start to break down and get rewritten or meld together, or have these apocryphal versions and like copies of copies of copies, something remains because there was something there, but they're like broken vessels.
Right. And which is something Robert Coover in his work kind of deals with a lot. The idea that you can take a myth and you can kind of by breaking it in some ways revitalize it or show what's left in terms of the life of the myth.
Yeah. I have a good friend who researches like indigenous myths and does a lot of work with, oral storytelling and dreams and those kind of ideas. And he really says, that it's a mistake to think of myths as a body of stories, like, the collected myths of, X, Y, or Z culture, but rather that it's an orientation toward reality. It's just a way of seeing the world is within myth.
Yeah.
And that these things are constantly self-reinventing and constantly volatile, like, some physical matter that you were working with that doesn't have a definite form.
Yeah. But it's something of a balancing act to both kind of acknowledge the myths and break them at the same time and ironize them and also still believe there's something there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And which maybe is just a pretty good definition of what it's like to live in the early 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's like it's like the equipment we were given from the 20th century, let's say, to live with is inadequate. Yeah. But it's also manifestly impossible to live with no equipment. So we constantly have broken equipment that we're tinkering with.
No, we got screwed by the 20th century, but that's okay. I mean, we'll do our best.
Yeah. Well, it's an ambiguous state that we kind of survived it, but also we survived into a place with no real blueprint.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's true. So the other thing I want to mention is that a certain amount of transgressiveness, at least sections of this book.
Yeah.
And I want you to just, do you have any thoughts just on transgression or on transgressive literature? I know that you sometimes teach deliberately transgressive work. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it, I think, is just what we were saying before, of like looking for these points of energy. So it's like could be language, could be, imagined geography, like of the interior of the country. It could be these old ideas of, here's how a Western works, or here's how, going to the city or going to the town, or here's like, what the integrity of bodies is and is not. And that if you start to work against the grain of that, you just find like little things that are still alive, right? It's like, it's like a scavenging act of like trying to like poke at, taboos or poke at, established ways of looking at reality and see if by kind of transgressing them or like distressing them or doing something a little bit that those ideas themselves don't want you to do, can you like excise something still alive from them? Whether that's humor, whether that's horror, whether that's just a moment of interest, whether that, because I think at the end of the day it's like you want the work to feel lively more than it needs to be about something. It needs to feel it's come to life.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think it has to, that's the case not only for readers, but for you as a writer as well. that the people who are doing transgressive literature that doesn't work for me, it's very clear to me that they don't find it challenging.
Mhm.
And so there, yeah.
Yeah, because it's an interesting question. It's like, can you find your inner, like the part of yourself that is still able to be shocked?
Yeah.
Or the spit, or when you reclaim that childlike glee of like, I'm doing something I'm not supposed to do,
Yeah.
the excitement you'd have it as a kid, like, learning a new word you're not supposed to say or something like
Yeah.
that, really gets at the sense that,
Yeah.
there is energy, the things can be activated.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
It's like the wasteland or something that we just don't want, like endless dead signifiers. Like we can't do anything with that.
Right, for sure. So the other thing, we talked about film in relation to this. We've just talked about transgression, which kind of leads me to think about transgressive filmmakers and two of the kind of patron saints of this book, I guess, if you want to call them that, to go back into the mythology, would be David Cronenberg and David Lynch. So the two Davids. There's probably others as well, and I'd be curious to hear about that. But what is, how does body horror kind of fit into this myth? Or
yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, Cronenberg is. I think in the book they say, DC, David Cronenberg is also Dodge City, right? That the two DCs line up.
Right.
I'm just interested in that idea of permeability, in the sense, I think this relates to what we were saying before of like the writer needing to feel activated by the work. Someone like Cronenberg is really a master of showing how the body is permeable to all kinds of forces that it would like to think that it's not.
Right.
Whether it's infection, amputation, something more like cerebral or psychedelic. Like, I did this research project about Daniel Paul Schreber, this German judge who became obsessed with the idea of like cosmic rays.
That Freud wrote about quite a bit.
That Freud wrote about, that were altering his nervous system and, and all this kind of stuff. But, and that's maybe a 20th century idea too, or late 19th century of invention of X-rays and the idea that just our bodies are far less sealed off from the world than we imagine.
And then I can also kind of translate that just into the geography of the place too, the notion that places are not sealed off from one another as well. So
yeah, I think you have a great line in, I think, The Open Curtain, where you said nothing comes unmixed. But that idea that, and maybe that's a lot of like the dangerous side of religion or of dogma comes from, is trying to insist that things are pure, right? I mean, obviously we see where that goes. But I think the solution to that, at least from my own point of view, is not to say that there is no spirituality or that there is no mystic potential, but to really adopt the idea of heterodoxy and things just being mixed together and things never being quite what they seem and things never even being themselves if you look into them more.
No, I agree. I completely. I mean, that's a lot of my work. Obviously, is moving in that direction. But
it's a kind of mistake to say because the logic of purity is manifestly insane, that there's no power in those ideas, to say actually they just have to really be boiled down and mixed with all kinds of other sources and left open to constant surprise. I mean, I think that's like it's hard to say anything is beautiful in Cronenberg, but there's the sense that actually a lot of his characters want to be infected, want to be invaded, or in Videodrome he wants the TVs and the videos to go into himself.
No, for sure.
And that's where life comes from in a very real sense, that there is some constant mixing and matching of what's outside the world and what's inside our bodies.
Yeah, I mean, there's this constant notion of revision and adaptation, I suppose, in some ways. But it's more than that. I mean, it's also, there is this sense in Cronenberg that you I think it is this notion of the membrane and, being enclosed and the way in which that's, you're already not enclosed, that both things are coming into you, but also there's already something there.
Yeah, and that is sort of enlightenment, or like being aware of reality as it is in Cronenberg is not only being aware that you can't prevent the membrane from being penetrated, but that it's already happened.
Right, exactly.
It's always already happened. There's never a time when it hasn't happened.
Exactly, yeah.
In fact, that's all that's happening.
Right, exactly. Well, and it's so interesting too that it gets mixed up with computers and machines and simulated realities and how that develops over the course of his work as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and that I think it's related to writing too, that it's like you want to be you want to be open to things that are unexpected, which maybe actually is the deepest form of transgression, is not just to write about, some taboo sexual situation or something like that, but to actually transgress your own notion of what you thought you were working on. To really have some idea take over that, in a previous century, people might have called possession.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's true.
And to welcome that. I mean, to me, maybe this is a slurry line, but I would say a definition of sanity is not to never be possessed, but to be like safely possessed, to be open to ideas that, you can sort of give, take, and have a release valve with, which for us is writing.
Right. Well, so and with that, I mean, when you were working on a room in Dodge City, both this one and the previous one, did you have a pretty clear sense of where we're going to go, or did you kind of come across a lot of surprises?
Definitely a lot of surprises. So the first one I actually started in Germany, where I lived before, like after college and before grad school. And it was when I was working on Angel House, which that felt like a much more monolithic, there was a kind of sense of like, Sisyphean quality to it. And then Dodge City, I did almost as a kind of side project or as an antidote, with this sort of Calvino idea of lightness, of trying to do something that was more fleet-footed and more occasional and more, could be done more quickly, specifically with less planning.
Yeah.
So I really did the first one. I don't think I thought of it as a trilogy, although when I put it together into a book, I knew there was more material, both literally in the sense of there being other chapters that I'd written, and in a more psychic sense that I could feel that there was this larger world of it. So then it was really when I started writing the second one that I started picturing the third and saying, okay, now I can see how, these three books are themselves sort of the beginning, middle, and end of a story.
Right. Even though I'm sure there'll be more surprises along the way as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
And just like the notion of the like American project and the American story got rapidly stranger during the course of working on it. So I think that there's no way not to filter that into it also. Right.
No, that makes sense for sure. And that's one thing that's interesting. I think that a lot of work that's fantastical or surreal, which I think this definitely is, does have a relationship to the real that is sometimes not acknowledged fully. And
it has to be there. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like a means of accessing the real.
Right.
It's almost like of sneaking up on it, of accessing the real in a way that the real itself didn't think you were going to do.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And I feel like the opposite might also be true, that if you write in an explicitly realist manner, I mean, great works can be done, but there's a danger of like you're approaching the real head on, and it wants to evade you, so you can end up missing.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I do think it's a question too. I mean, the thing we were talking about earlier of, are you depicting the real, or are you creating an image of the real that stands in for it? Yeah. And for me, that's realism is a little too unaware sometimes that it's creating an image of the real.
And that it is a style and a set of conventions, the same way anything else is. Surrealism. Yeah. And that's maybe the naivete of the narrator a little bit in volume 2.
Yeah.
That he thinks, if he could become blueprints and he'll be a kind of master of reality, that the real will no longer evade him.
Yeah.
Or no longer persecute him, that he won't be on thin ice in Dodge City in the way that he otherwise is.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned earlier, I mean, this volume's a Künstlerroman, so it's a kind of novel about the artist's development. And so it does make sense that he has these kind of naivetes that he's working through and, discovering where he's going to go exactly.
Yeah. And I don't think it's entirely wrong in the sense that, like we were saying before, you have this dream that, you'll make it if you can get, usually by comparing yourself to someone else, right? And that seems like is certainly not the case. But there is a sense that like, if you do develop a method of, writing or creating artwork that works for you, and maybe that works for some other people, you do have a sense that you can take a more active role in your own perceptions. That like dreams and ideas and experiences aren't just hitting you head on, and you're just absorbing the impact. There's more take, and that you can actually output something from that. That does go here, that is something.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's true. Yeah.
And that is, makes you feel more able to just live in the world, especially in a really strange time.
In these strange times, for sure. Well, I think we may be coming pretty close to the end of our time. Can I ask you, I mean, what have you read lately or watched lately that you found interesting? Are there other things that you can recommend to
Absolutely.
people?
Let me think. So I'm back in Kansas now, and I actually read In Cold Blood for the first time. For some reason,
Oh.
I just never, it's one of those things that like you hear about so much that you almost think you've read it, but
Right.
I had, so I read that recently, and we went way out to not the exact town where the murders happened, but like that part of Western Kansas, which was pretty resonant to really be in that world.
For sure.
So that was really interesting.
Yeah.
And I like, speaking of like the spirit of place, I kind of like to read classic works about places that I'm in.
Yeah.
There's something about that.
Do you know there's another Capote book which is called Hand-Carved Coffins, or it's a novella called that, and it's a similar kind of crime story, but much tighter novella length. And
wow, no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where it may be. I'll have to figure out where it is exactly, but it's in one of his books.
Interesting.
And it's if you've read In Cold Blood, I think it's a really nice thing to kind of read next to that.
Cool, I definitely will.
Yeah.
And other than that, speaking of transgressive work, do you know Ariana Harwitz, who wrote Die, My Love, and she has this new book called Feeble Minded?
I know of her, but I haven't.
Those are really fascinating. Those really kind of made an impression. They're really intense. I think she's Argentine but lives in France. I think they're written in Spanish, but they're very French.
I'll check it out.
Those are really intense.
The Capote book is Music for Chameleons is where
Music for
where Hand-Carved Coffins is. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
How about you in terms of?
Well, I'm trying to think of what's really stood out lately. I've a lot this year, and partly because you're isolated, and what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
When you were talking about Schreiber before, I was just thinking there's a new book by D. Harlan Wilson, which is about Schreiber, a novel kind of related to him, which I thought was interesting. I just read Robert Aikman's Go Back at Once, which is his kind of posthumous novel, which is a weird book. It's kind of it almost feels like what would happen if John Galsworthy was writing like slightly supernatural fiction. So it's very clever, it's very funny sometimes, or someone like Anthony Powell, someone like that. But if they're doing like less realistic stuff, I really like that.
Cool.
One of the books I loved this year is or last year was Laird Hunt's In the House in the Dark of the Wood.
Oh yeah, I read that. That book's really cool.
Yeah, I just taught that, and I'd read it before. It really teaches well. So yeah.
Yeah, he's really interesting. I like his work a lot.
Yeah. What about movies? Or I mean, I know it's hard to see movies now, except kind of on a smaller screen.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. What's really TV. Yeah, the thing that's made the biggest impression on me lately is Bruno Dumont.
Oh yeah,
the French director who I'd seen a couple of his things earlier, but I've gone on a more sequential tour through his works. I watched La Vie de Jésus, L'Humanité.
Yeah. Humanité was the first one I saw of his, which I think is just incredibly good and incredibly devastating.
Yeah. He's like a new kind of patron saint. I feel like there's certain people who I really want, like when I encounter their work, I want to like enlist them in my own imaginary pantheon, just have them with me. And he's someone who, especially because the way the films relate to towns and have these kind of, almost cosmic events, but in these like really remote backwaters. I just love.
Have you watched his Joan of Arc stuff?
No, I haven't yet.
Okay,
that'll be next step.
It's really. I'll be curious to see what you think, because they're. I think they're great, but they're also like they're so different from some of the other stuff.
He really lightened up. He became a sort of like slapstick artist, which is cool. Yeah. If that's where your journey could take you, that's a pretty good sign, I think.
Yeah, it's not so bad. Yeah. So I'm trying to think if I know anyone who's taken the journey the other direction, but no. Yeah. There's
a great line in a Bill Callahan song where he says, I used to be darker, then I got lighter, then I got dark again.
Yeah, that's good.
That's
awesome.
More or less gets at it.
Yeah. All right. We may be just about there.
Perfect. This is great.
I'm jumping back in. You guys, I love so much ending with a whole slew of recommendations. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome.
And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think our listeners will too. I just wanted to see before we go if there's anything else you want to mention. If you've got an event coming up you want to plug, or other books people could look for of yours. Anything else on your mind?
What do you think, David?
Yeah, I have a couple. So I have, so Dodge City 2 is coming out on the 26th of this month, so a week and change, about 2 weeks. Then the story collection, which is 10 years worth of stories, and it's really all the stories more or less so far, except really early ones, is coming out in June from 1111 Press. So I'm very excited about that. And then next year, I have a novel about Joseph Cornell called The New House that's going to come out with Whiskey Tit early in the year, like in March or so. And then Dodge City 3, which I'm still working on, hopefully will come out at the end of 2022.
So you're busy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of stuff that's sort of been moving through the pipeline,
Right.
But it's exciting to kind of see it all surface now, although it won't be the best time to travel with it, but we'll see what happens later in the year.
Yeah. And then I have a new collection that's coming out in August, which is called The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. And
The best title. I love it so much.
If you're not laughing already, what's wrong with you? Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, does it continue the kind of science fictional trajectory?
So it has some science fictional stories. It has some, it's basically SF horror when it's science fictional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then it also has a lot of ecological stories, which are kind of near future, also horror, because that's how ecology works these days.
Yeah.
And then, just a variety of stuff, but I think there's definitely more kind of inclination towards ecological and kind of post human stuff.
Yeah. We may be approaching the cusp.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. I'm looking forward to that.
Cool.
That'll be something to look forward to for the summer.
Fantastic. All right, guys. Well, thank you again so much for this conversation. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your work. I hope we get to do this in person sometime, but let's fingers crossed for 2022.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
It wasn't going to be 2021, but 2022. Here we come.
Yeah. We'll see.
Right.
All right, guys. Well, thanks again.
Sounds good.
David Leo Rice and Brian Evenson were my guests today. The book they discussed was A Room in Dodge City, Volume 2. You can get it from SKYLIT Books. Head on over to our website, skylitbooks.com. You can get all of David's books and all of Brian's books, and perhaps we'll even have some signed copies of Brian's books very soon.
Very soon. Yep.
Fantastic.
All right, everybody. Take care out there, and thank you so much for listening. We will catch you on the flip side.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.